Good day everyone, my name is Andrew Friskop and I'm a serial extension plant pathologist at NDSU, and today I'm going to be speaking on corn diseases. Specifically, I'm going to be addressing some of the Goss's wilt research we've been doing over the last couple of years, and also introducing a new disease we found last year in southern rust, and diving more into the different types of rust diseases we can see on corn and whether or not we need to manage them. So the first disease I want to talk about is Goss's leaf blight and wilt. First of all, this continues to be our most important corn disease because we can find it across the entire state of North Dakota, but there are still some susceptible hybrids out there where you can see some pretty significant yield losses in a given year. So a little bit of background history on Goss's wilt. The pathogen is caused by a bacterium and it's residue borne. It can be seed borne, but for the most part in our state we are worried about the residue. It can survive for 10 to 12 months, so any way that residue is moved from field to field is more or less is how it can be spread. In our state, the primary host we have is corn, and the reason why I say it's a primary host is not all hosts are created equal for this disease. You can find it on sorghum and other grassy weeds, but the preferred host is going to be corn, as we're not quite sure on what like the foxtails and the crabgrass has on direct implications to the agronomic setting in our state. The conditions that favor this disease are warm temperatures and humidity, anything that causes crop injury, especially rainstorms. If there's one factor where we can see where this disease is driven by is by rainstorms, hail, strong winds. We can often pick up more Goss's wilt in those fields that have had more severe weather events. When it comes to diagnosis of this disease, it is more or less a defoliator. We generally will start noticing it in the upper canopy, middle canopy. You'll see leaf tip dieback, you'll see water soaking, you'll see chlorosis and necrosis, and more or less it looks like you see grease spots on the outer edges of these lesions. To help differentiate this disease from some of the other mimics out there, there's a few key things we can look for. One is freckles, as the arrow is highlighting here. These freckles are very diagnostic for this disease, and at one time it was known as leaf freckles disease because of it. Another thing to look for are signs of the bacteria, and what I have circled for you is you see those orange yellow type of spots sitting on this lesion. That is more of the bacterial ooze that has come out of the leaf surface. Now when you go out there on a dewy morning or after when the sun is apparent, you can see a glaze or glossy type of appearance in these bacterial ooze, and that more or less kind of confirms that it is indeed caused by a bacterial disease. So with this disease, identification is always important because there are a couple mimics out there as well. So in this I'm showing you an example, and this was actually taken from the Carrington REC. It was out there 2 years ago, and this is showing you Goss's wilt, leaf miner, and an abiotic stressor. So to kind of help differentiate Goss's wilt from these, as Goss wilt is going to have those irregular water-soaked lesions and leaf freckles. Leaf miner is more or less going to be contained to a small area, almost looks papery in the damage of what it's causing. And abiotic stressors can be contained to the leaf vein, have a different color, and it may start seeing very streaky burning. So the reason how I want to bring this out is identification of Goss wilt is often the first step with this disease and can be argued for any disease that we have in the state. So how much Goss's wilt have we seen in the state? I think the best way to explain this is we've been doing a corn disease survey since 2014, and I'm showing you the percentage of fields that we found Goss's in. Now this is just telling us if we found Goss's, whether if it was a small patch or if it was a much larger patch in the field. And as we go across the years, we see some variability, but the trend that we're seeing over the past 3 years is we're starting to see more Goss's wilt in the state. This past year we found it in 65% of the fields, and I would say that in the fields we found it, it was very sporadic. It was a pocket here or there, maybe on a field edge, and likely did not lead to much yield loss. Some cases I have received reports or phone calls or photos of fields that you did have an early infection where they had some substantial yield loss, but in most of the fields that we looked at this past year, I would say that we saw sporadic spots of the disease within the field. What did we scout this year? Due to COVID, we had to spend most of our time on the eastern side of the state. We found it from the southeast corner up to the northeast corner. Now, I know our swath only extended out to the Carrington area, but with that being said, is it's very common to find this disease. In previous years, we have found it out in Williston, we have found it out by Minot, we have found it in Grant County in the southwest corner of the state. So my message is it's likely that we have Goss wilt just about everywhere in corn production regions. The biggest thing we have to think about is identification and how do we manage it. The easiest way to think of the management plan starts with hybrid selection. That is our key. That is our most important management tool. And be able to help convey why this is so important, I'm going to show you some results that we conducted in the field with support from the Corn Utilization Council. Here we looked at 3 different hybrids varying in susceptibility, and we inoculated the pathogen at 3 times, either at the V6 to V10, R1, or what I call a double inoculation event of V6 to V10, and again at R1. Now what we're looking for is yield loss compared to a non-inoculated check. So basically where there was no disease present or very little disease to where we were able to establish a high disease. And across the 3 years of studies, we found that mean yield losses for the susceptible hybrid could range from 34 to 41% with an early infection event. For mildly susceptible, 22 to 25, and for resistant, 6 to 11. How I interpret this data on a big scale thing is if you're making that decision between a susceptible hybrid and resistant, you're looking at about a 30% yield loss difference, meaning that just by selecting a hybrid can negate a lot of the issues that we may have with yield loss for this disease. When we tend to see Goss wilt in some fields develop in that VT to R1 stage, we do experience some yield loss, as some of this data has shown, but it's not near to the extent of what would happen if you had it earlier in the season. So, take-home message, hybrid resistance does pay. Yet we still get some questions about what can I spray on it. As I mentioned, it is a bacteria, so we don't have a fungicide that's labeled for it. So a way to kind of take a stab at some of the products out there to see if there's anything that can help suppress disease. We started the first year of some Corn Utilization Council sponsored trials. We had it at 2 locations, one in Prosper and the other in Kindred, North Dakota. Fortunately, the Prosper location had some drown out event that prevented us from taking yield, but we still did get disease data. And the big picture of these trials was to use a susceptible hybrid and to see if there was a rescue treatment out there. Now, how this treatment list looks is we had a non-inoculated and inoculated check, so basically one that had disease introduced and one that did not. And we had the application of a couple different treatments. Friskop, which is a copper sulfate based plant protection product. Oxidate 5.0, which is hydrogen peroxide and periacetic acid. 42 phi copper, which is basically a liquid fertilizer with the addition of copper in it. And Veltima, which was a fungicide check. I wasn't expecting a fungicide to do anything, but we threw it in there anyway as a check just to kind of prove the point. Now we would apply these 4 treatments either at V10 or V12 or at VT to R1. So we're looking at 2 application timings and we're looking at these 4 treatments specifically. We had a high level of disease develop at the Kindred location, so I'm going to present some of the disease severity data as well as the yield data from this location specifically. So we rated it multiple times, and with that, we're able to have a good idea of how disease progressed. And taking a snapshot of time, this was the average leaf severity that we saw at the R3 to R4 stage, so later on in the growing season, because I think this tells a pretty good story as far as what we're seeing in the trials. Now, the top 2 is our checks, so the non-inoculated and inoculated. As expected, our non-inoculated had the lowest amount of disease severity across all the treatments. But compared to the inoculated check, we had some interesting results. First of all, the treatments of Friskop and 42 phi, either at V10 or V12 or at VT or R1, seem to provide disease suppression. And this is noticeable in the plots too, where you could see that disease didn't take off as quickly. However, by season's end, it looked like the disease was able to outrun the residual of any of those products. And the bigger story is, what did it do for yield? Was it able to protect any yield? So using those same treatments set up, this time looking at yield, The top two bars are our two checks. The highest yielding treatment in this specific trial was the non-inoculated at 160 bushels, and none of the treatments were able to compare to get up to that level. So nothing we sprayed out there was able to completely prevent the yield loss imposed by Goss's wilt. But if we compare it to the inoculated check, you'll notice that some of these treatments did have seems to be a yield trend response. Now, this is something that we have to explore a little bit further, and of course, doing it next year, we're going to be able to get more site years in this, but there are some responses with copper, it appears, that to provide some trend of yield protection. Now, I won't say this is a definitive trend, and I won't say this is statistically sound right now, but it's something that we're going to further tease out to see if there's anything as far as these treatments and application timing that can help protect some of that yield if you ever have a susceptible hybrid with a high level of Gosses. So changing gears here a little bit, I'm going to touch on the other thing that we saw this year, and this was southern rust of corn. And this was a first for me, as indicated in this tweet. And the reason why this is important is we have rust diseases in corn in the state. We've always have noticed common rust, but southern rust is the new rust disease that we observed. To kind of look at these side by side, in this top leaf we have southern rust and our bottom leaf is common rust. So in this we can see there's a visual difference, but why does this matter? What does this mean? So let's do a side by side comparison of what these two rust diseases look like. Common rust is overwinters in the southern U.S., where southern rust is going to overwinter in tropical areas. Both are driven by leaf wetness and high humidity. Common rust prefers cool temperatures, while southern rust prefers temperatures around 80 degrees and higher. So what does this mean? What does this kind of tell us? So the first thing to kind of briefly summarize what this looks like is these southern rust pathogen spores are blown in from these tropical areas. And but this diagram depicted at the Crop Protection Network website, it shows a pretty good example of how this works on a diagram scale. But to help make this a little bit clearer is when I think about southern rust in the state is I think about when is it first documented in the U.S. So this is from my colleague down in Alabama, Ed Sikora, and when he says he's found southern rust, that starts that stopwatch. That's when everybody else north of him are going to start scouting for the disease. And one way we do this is through the iPipe system. We're able to track southern rust and reports of southern rust throughout the growing season. Now this was a snapshot taken, but as you can see, anything that's highlighted in red is a positive report. And we saw a high level of this disease in Nebraska and in South Dakota, and then we found it in North Dakota late in the season. So did it really amount to mean anything? Well, lucky for us is we were past the dent stage. We're an advanced crop before the southern rust spores were detected, and it did not lead to any yield loss, and I'll explain that in a little bit more. The other thing we have to think about is how these differentiate between for diagnosis. So for common rust, you're going to have that dark brown. They're going to be kind of sporadic on a leaf tissue type of look when it comes to diagnosis. Where southern rust is going to be more orange, often going to have that bright halo surrounding that pustule, and it's going to be very concentrated. It almost looks like pustules are going to be developing on top of each other. Those are two easy ways to help differentiate it. And of course, though, is you might have mixtures of these on the same leaf, and that might be sometimes make it easier, or it can actually make it more complex what you're looking at. And the biggest thing why we're worried about southern rust is hybrid resistance. In northern corn hybrids, common rust has enough hybrid resistance built in where we don't have to worry about it so much. Southern rust, the major resistance gene was overcome, and we don't have that hybrid resistance, so therefore we have to look at other management strategies. The biggest yield losses that we see with southern rust in the southern states is when this disease is detected between tasseling and R2, because most hybrids are susceptible, and because of that, several fungicides can be used and are very effective if applied between tasseling and R3. In this case, we found the disease well past that window and at very low incidence, prevalence, where we found it, I think, at 3 sites in the state. So we likely did not have any yield loss in 2020. So the last question of southern rust is, will it be a problem next year? And simply put, is it all could depend on what we see for documentation in the U.S., those winds that blow north to see if it carries any spores, and what type of temperatures we have. So speaking of 2021, what can we look at as far as being important for corn production and diseases? Focus should still be on Goss's wilt, and hybrid selection is key. But I always encourage everybody to keep your eyes trained to avoid extra input costs, meaning that we should not be applying a fungicide for a Goss's wilt problem. The last thing I want to touch on is there are a few diseases right now in the U.S. that have not been confirmed in North Dakota. Bacterial leaf streak and tar spot are these two diseases that, if they were ever established in the state, I think they'd be able to overwinter pretty effectively. So there's something to, in the next 5 to 10 years to keep your eyes on those two diseases. So I appreciate your attention for this talk today. And if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or ask me questions during the roundtable discussion. Thank you.